Hello, everybody. Welcome back. AP US History. Here we go. This is our next chapter, Chapter 11, the Early American Economy. So, in this chapter, we're going to take a look at, well, it says in the name right there, the early American economy, but what specifically is going on during this early 1800s period? It relates to the kind of idea of growing national unity, but also it relates to the idea of growing sectionalism in the United States, especially between the North and the South. Let's take a look at the early American economy. How does the United States eventually transition into becoming a major industrial power? That's not going to happen in this unit, and it's certainly not going to happen, arguably, until after the Civil War. But kind of the groundwork of America's transition to becoming that industrial powerhouse that has its legacy in the early 1800s in the kind of creation of the factory system in the North, the creation of large-scale infrastructure projects, and kind of the more general cultural shift towards a trade-based, commercialized society. Before I start the timer, let's take a look at the lesson objectives. We're going to take a look at the market revolution, that kind of major economic shift in which America transitions from being an economy of self-sufficient farmers into being an economy of people dependent on a wider economy to make their living and to just exist in a day-to-day setting. But we're going to see that expressed in culture and the economy. All right. Let me go ahead and set a 20-minute timer, and Bob's your uncle. Here we go. So, kind of the central idea of this chapter is going to be the idea of the market revolution. Now, the market revolution is not a term per se, but it should be. But it is kind of the concept that America is transitioning away from self-sufficient yeoman farmers into becoming more trade-based, aka commercialized, aka market-focused economy. But kind of this commercial revolution, this market revolution, I should say, it's happening all across the United States. It's easy to say that it's just a northern development, but that's not entirely true. It is one that really does connect the economy, but you could make the argument that the way it does it kind of drives apart the United States. Let's take a look at kind of the market revolution. What is going on? Well, in the North, we see it expressed in the form of manufacturing. In the South, we see it expressed in the form of cotton cash crop production. But in the West, we see it expressed in the form of large scale food production, namely things like wheat and corn. But what is exactly causing this transition from away from yeoman farmery to a more commercialized society? Well, kind of, we see politically, the government is supporting this through the American system. The American system mostly benefits the North in terms of tariffs, in terms of other things. But in order for that kind of northern economy to work, it does depend on food to feed the cities, and that food comes from the West. But it also depends on cotton. It depends on the central raw material of this manufacturing, which is textile based. It depends on cotton production. Everybody needs clothes, everybody needs to wear clothes, but in order to make those clothes, you need cotton, and that cotton largely comes from the South. However, in order to encourage this interconnected economic system, that's where we see another development happening at this time called the transportation revolution. You see, America is able to be connected even without the building of roads and canals, thanks to our extensive waterway system. We've got the Mississippi River, we've got the Ohio River, we've got, however, as well, artificial means of making that transportation a lot easier. For one thing, we've got new tech in the early 1800s, including the steamship. By the end of this market revolution, we start to see the rise of railroads, chugga chugga choo choo, steamboats, steam powered locomotives. But we also see the development of waterways artificially. We see, for example, the creation of canals, and we'll talk about the Erie Canal in just a second. We see roads being built, namely things like the Old National Road, but on the state level, things like the New Jersey Turnpike. But generally, kind of the market revolution on a national scale, it is going to affect how people see the economy. People are cogs in the machine, whether they be industrial factory workers or whether they be commercialized farmers out west. You're no longer producing just for yourself, you're producing for a wider community, people well beyond your local area. And in general, this does create a more nationally connected economy for better or for worse. For better in the form of increased general economic prosperity, but for worse because if the economy of one place falls flat, the economy of all the places is going to fall flat. If the North's economy collapses, then it doesn't need so much cotton from the South, and it doesn't need so much food from the West. And kind of all of that is connected. But first, we're going to take a look at kind of how the market revolution impacts the western part of the United States. Well, as I indicated earlier, the western part of the United States, that means places like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, kind of all of these places count as the American West, basically everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, what is going to be the focus of this? Well, the focus is food production, namely large scale wheat, namely large scale corn production. Largely, this food would be then sold into these northern centers, these northern urban centers. It would also be sold into the South as well. Remember, every bit of agricultural land in the South largely is going towards cotton production. However, the West is kind of the area that is the least settled of all of these places. The East Coast is being filled to the brim with people who've already been living there. And there's a population explosion by the 1820s. In the 1820s, most of that population growth is native natural increase. So, American citizens having children. But after the 1820s, we start to see a rise of Irish and German immigration. This Irish and German immigration is going to be really important for urban development. We'll talk about that more in a second, but it's also important for Western development because this overcrowding nature of these East Coast cities is going to compel westward migration, both from the immigrants themselves, namely the Germans, but also from people who've been living here for a couple of generations now. However, we also see that kind of the creation of new technologies allows for people to move out west. Steamships, eventually railroads, these things are going to help westward development in the form of not only getting people out west, but bringing materials out east. But we also see, unfortunately, the West is able to be settled thanks to Native American removal. We're going to see, we already saw that in the Northwestern territories like Illinois and Wisconsin and Minnesota, but we're going to see that in the South at the end of this unit. But in order for people to get out west, like I said, you need ways to get there. For one thing, the federal government is going to step in the form of the old National Road. This is the only federally funded infrastructure project until the 1860s, but more on that later. It's up to the states, on the other hand, to kind of compel this westward migration in the form of state infrastructure projects. Namely, the best example of this is the Erie Canal. Now, the Erie Canal, the spookiest waterway in America, ha ha ha, you're so funny. It is going to be a series of artificial canals that connect the Great Lakes and the Hudson River. The Hudson River is kind of the lifeblood that connects to the major trading port city of New York. Now, kind of the Great Lakes, that is generally connecting to the West over there. And all of these Western farmers, they want to bring their goods to these big industrial centers like New York, for example. Now, they could do that over land, but waterways are much faster. And actually, the Erie Canal is going to have the major effect of interconnecting the West and the North of the United States. It's going to lead to kind of an increased need for Western farm goods. And kind of these Western communities, they're going to buy all their manufactured stuff from the northern areas of the country. Sorry, I needed a drink. All right, cool. Erie Canal. But we also see that kind of this creation of a textile manufacturing center in the north, and we'll talk about that more in a second. It was largely compelled by the fact that cotton is more easy to produce. Now, cotton production is going to be the major industry of the southern United States. And the reason why is there's a demand for it in the north, thanks to the need for clothing, but also the need for textile manufacturing. But also, it's just easier to produce cotton thanks to the development of something called the cotton gin. Now, the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, it was a device that essentially removed the seed from the cotton and just left all the fibers. And the fibers, that's what you use in cotton production. However, we're going to see that the cotton gin, despite its kind of benefit in the overall national economy, it is going to have profound effects on the South, especially. We see, for one thing, cash crop production in the South is going to transition away from things like tobacco to things like cotton. Tobacco was the major industry in the early United States. It was the major industry during the colonial period. Now, thanks to the cotton gin, it's cotton. But kind of the impact of cotton and this desire for cotton is going to compel increased desire for westward expansion, especially in the southeast of the United States. And how that manifests in regards to Native American relations, we'll talk about that in our next chapter. But we do see that cotton is going to help develop the national economy as a whole. The cotton's grown in the south, it's transported up to the north, either along ships along the east coast using steamships, up the Mississippi River, also using steamships, or just through those kind of land-based trade routes. It's mostly through those waterways, though. However, kind of because cotton is king, to use a term from the 1850s, because cotton is so important, that does mean that those that make cotton and produce it are also more important. And unfortunately, that does mean a rise of African American slavery. Slavery and the domestic slave trade skyrockets thanks to cotton production. And actually, it's because of this increased importance of slavery that we start to see more national debates about the existence of slavery. We are not going to see much in the way of radical abolitionist movements, and certainly ones that don't believe in racial equality. And we do see, however, that there are kind of debates about slavery, about its spread. The first example of this, arguably, is the Missouri Compromise, which we talked about in the previous chapter. But we do see that slavery's expansion and its very notable brutality does make some people uncomfortable. Unfortunately, though, it does not mean that a lot of people are sympathetic towards immediate abolition or about racial equality. And kind of an example of that discomfort with slavery, but opposition, I should say, to equality with African Americans is something called the American Colonization Society. Now, the American Colonization Society, which was supported by figures like Henry Clay, figures like future President Abraham Lincoln, supported by a lot of different figures in the United States, well-respected figures, it is going to have the solution of we're going to free slaves from the United States and transport them to West Africa. Eventually, they found the country that becomes Liberia, actually. But kind of the American Colonization Society, it does represent an increased concern about the existence and future of slavery, while also representing the racial attitudes of the United States. However, kind of the opposition to slavery by white people honestly doesn't matter that much because not a lot of white people were against it. The resistance against slavery by black people, though, that's more important, at least in terms of uncovering voices that haven't really been explored that much in American history. For example, there's Nat Turner's rebellion in the 1830s, there's the German Coast Uprising in the 1810s, and there's the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in the 1820s. Now, we'll talk about all of these conspiracies and slave rebellions more in our next unit, actually. But it is important to understand that slaves, they did not like being slaves, despite what some historians you will read will say. Ultimately, though, what is the big part of the country that changes the most, arguably? The West was always farmers, the South was always plantations, the North, that's kind of the biggest transition. Because the big thing that the North is going to focus on is not necessarily just buying stuff from Europe anymore, it's making it themselves. what we see really become the first major industry is textile production. There are new technologies that are invented, not just the cotton gin, but things like the spinning jenny, things like the water wheel, kind of that its power and its connection to the steam engine. All of these things are going to be important in allowing for the production of cotton. But there are other things as well that caused this sort of first industrial revolution. This is comparable to what you learned about in World and Euro last year, the first industrial revolution. For one thing, we don't just see technology like the cotton gin, like the steam engine, like the spinning jenny, but we also see that the workers of these factories, they tended to be the immigrants coming to the United States. Immigrants really formed the much needed labor in these early industrial factories. A lot of the cheapest labor was found in factories, and a bunch of the workers that took on that cheap labor were Irish women, actually, single unmarried Irish women. But in addition to these immigrant laborers causing this kind of rise of factories, we also see that the geography of the North is very good for industrialization, especially in the early days before the steam engine, when it depended on the use of the water. Flowing through rivers, for example. The North's economy, excuse me, its geography is not very good for self-sufficient farmers. It's super good, though, for manufacturing centers. But beyond just kind of the geography and the technology and the labor, the government of the United States is going to help support and fuel this industrialization. For one thing, the American system, with its bank providing loans to industrial merchants, with its tariffs protecting the American manufacturers from cheaper, more easily made European goods, but also the internal infrastructure to get that stuff to the rest of the country. However, kind of the biggest group that supports the American system, arguably, is the Supreme Court, actually. The Supreme Court is led at this point by John Marshall. John Marshall is a former Federalist, actually, and generally, whenever he takes the stand, he is going to favor kind of Northern Federalist Party interests. That means that he supports making the American economy more industrial. He also supports having a strong federal government over that of state governments. So kind of let's see some examples of that. The three big Supreme Court cases in terms of the market revolution led by John Marshall are the following. There's McCulloch v. Maryland, which has the effect of legalizing and, or I should say, declaring constitutional once and for all the Bank of the United States. The whole issue with McCulloch v. Maryland was that the state of Maryland was trying to tax the Bank of the United States. Its bank chair representative in Maryland was a guy named McCulloch. But we're going to see that in the Supreme Court is going to side with the Bank of the United States. It sides against the state of Maryland, and it says the bank is constitutional. What this does is that it has the effect of securing the bank's existence so that it can continue to help support businesses and smaller banks support those said businesses. There's Dartmouth College v. Woodward, and in this case, it is going to respect the right of contract. The state of Maryland was trying to, I don't want to say nationalize, but statify, basically take ownership of Dartmouth College. Now, thanks to the intervention of the Supreme Court, New Hampshire loses this attempt to take over a private institution, Dartmouth College. What this does on the bigger picture is that it sets up the federal government's support and backing of monopolies and the right of businesses to just do what they want unregulated by the government, either state or federal government. But there's also Gibbons v. Ogden. Gibbons v. Ogden is going to kind of guarantee, again, the national government's power, but it also is going to show the very pro-business leanings of the government. Gibbons was a steamship captain who was granted a federal monopoly to do business in the New York, New Jersey area, whereas Ogden was granted a monopoly to operate by the state of New York. Ultimately, though, John Marshall is going to rule in favor of Gibbons. Gibbons was given a federal contract. He does business between states. Therefore, it's under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Again, all of these Supreme Court cases have the effect of increasing federal support for private businesses, whether that be kind of the legality of the Bank of the United States with McCulloch v. Maryland, whether that be the right of contract with Dartmouth v. Woodward, or whether that be the guarantee of monopolies approved by the federal government under Gibbons v. Ogden. Now, the impact of all of this economic development in the North is that it really does change kind of where things are produced. For one thing, we are going to see a transition from the household to the factory, aka Waltham system. The household system was producing stuff in your own home. It was producing stuff sometimes through piecemeal. You're going to make the shirt sleeves, you're going to make the shirt hemmed, you're going to dye it, whatever, etc. However, what we see under the market revolution, under this first industrial revolution more so, is that all of the centers of production are housed in one spot. That's what the factory Waltham system is. The Waltham system was supported by a group called the Boston Associates. These were New England merchants who pooled their money together to invest in building a factory system in Lowell, Massachusetts. This Waltham system, that's basically having all the production under one roof. And an example of that is the Lowell Mills. Lowell, Massachusetts is going to become kind of the model for how future factories are going to develop in the United States. And largely these Lowell systems, these Lowell, I should say, mills, these would be spots where all the workers would live. Would be spots where all the yarn was produced. This would be spots where all the yarn was dyed. This would be spots where then the yarn was converted into textiles. So again, we're housing all production in one spot. Now, I said all the workers live there, but who are these workers? Well, it relates to a much wider trend in American history. Not only are people now dependent on wage work to make their living, and therefore don't own as much property or are self-sufficient farmers and have to buy stuff from the market, but we also see that a lot of these early workers in the factories, especially before later developments in American history, are going to be unmarried women. Now, initially, they're native-born women, but eventually we kind of see them replaced by immigrant Irish women, especially. So, kind of these factory jobs are going to give some opportunities for women to have opportunities to make money outside of the home, free of their parents. When they're married, no, they're getting out of those factories. But kind of free of their parents, there is a degree of self-independence for women. All right. So that was the market revolution in a nutshell. We took a look at developments in the north just now. We took a look at developments in the south just a second ago, and we took a look at developments in the west just also a second ago. All right, that is it. We're going to move on to our last chapter of Unit 3. All right. Can I stop the picture? Can I stop it? No, I cannot. Oh, yes, I can. All right, and